talk about how the U.S. starts to mobilize after they've officially declared war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. Again, there are some similarities here with World War I, so don't be at all surprised by that. First off, you're going to see a pretty significant influx of propaganda, much of which is actually sponsored directly by the U.S. government to help get the U.S. population rallying behind the war effort, to help financial incentives, raising money for the war, as well as helping even those who do not actually enlist in the military services to still sort of do their part effectively to help the war effort. So one element of mobilization can be epitomized with this idea of the arsenal of democracy. An arsenal is essentially a storage of weapons, right? So the arsenal of democracy is actually a metaphorical term suggesting that the U.S. Was preparing itself to protect democracy. The reason why it was getting involved in the war was not to be aggressive, but rather to defend the sort of principles that all the Allied nations had drawn up after World War I was over. So again, not a war to sort of destroy, but a war to protect the democracy that they had established after the First World War. The arsenal of democracy idea was epitomized by the amount of American propaganda that was released to promote the war effort. The U.S. at first, before they actually declared war against Japan, Germany, and Italy, promised to supply allied nations such as the UK with supplies to fight the Germans while they stayed out of the actual fighting. So again, we see a lot of similarities between that and the First World War in the sense that, they got indirectly involved in an economic sense and directly involved in a military sense later. Additionally, Congress and FDR created laws and numerous new government agencies to try to promote mobilization for war. So some of these agencies, but it's not at all limited to these, were the Office of Price Administration, the National War Labor Board, the War Manpower Commission, and the Office of War Mobilization. And then finally, you have the Office of War Information, which actually controlled what kind of news was released during the war. And much of the Office of War Information was trying to release news stories that promoted morale at home. So the Office of War Information actually did allow for some censorship of the news in the sense that any news story that could be released that actually might portray the war in a negative light might be limited or completely censored. And also, the Office of War Information limited civil liberties during war times. So in other ways of thinking about it, you could actually consider the Office of War Information to be like the Office of War Propaganda. Again, just like World War I, one of the major ways in which the Second World War was financed was through war bonds. So it was very successful due to the World War I effort, so it only made sense to bring back the idea of buying bonds to support the U.S. effort abroad. And also, again, it was a way that you could mobilize the non-fighting population. Even if you were a woman or even if you were beyond fighting age, you could still arguably take place in the war efforts just by borrowing money from the government in the form of a war bond. And this would also pay you back in dividends later once you waited for this bond to mature. You're also going to see that the New Deal effectively ends once the U.S. gets involved in the Second World War. A lot of this is because when the U.S. starts to mobilize, it starts to convert a lot of its private businesses into wartime production industries. And so essentially, so many of the New Deal programs were created to make jobs. Those organizations weren't needed anymore because the need for laborers was so high that they essentially did the job of the New Deal for them, right? So as mobilization proceeds, New Deal agencies start to vanish, and what you're going to see is that now the government is massively increasing spending and creating new programs to sponsor all these new jobs that are created by the war. Many observers are going to believe that the U.S.'s industrial capacity was the decisive factor behind really rapid and ubiquitous mobilization throughout the country. So the idea that the U.S. was so large in size, the idea that it had so many natural resources, the idea that it had an effective transportation system, all of these things make the mobilization effort pretty successful in the United States as a whole. The War Production Board oversaw the conversion of civilian firms for war purposes, as well as priming American industries for all-out production. So in other words, what we're going to see is that some organizations that were owned by private industries are going to effectively be taken over by the government during the war period. And that's a way that the government can actually dictate how much is being produced, what kind of prices we're looking at. So again, we see that during times of war, the federal government oftentimes takes a much bigger approach towards regulating the economy, and it seems as though the population is less resistant to that during a wartime. You're going to see that this increased production is going to contribute to an unprecedented economic boom, which effectively ends the Depression. But what's important for us to realize is that even though jobs increase, for the most part, most of the war profits are going to go towards the largest firms. So again, this is much more of a victory for capitalism. The average laborer might find himself in a situation where he can find a job more easily, but that does not necessarily mean that he's experiencing a remarkable increase in pay or living standards. You're also going to see that new regions like the West and the South are going to become major locations for defense production. They're going to receive a really large share of wartime production contracts. So the Second World War, in many ways, is going to sort of help these regions start to catch up industrially with their eastern, northeastern, and midwestern counterparts. You're also going to see that just like World War I, World War II leads to increased farm profits. But one of the problems that we see happening here is that individual farmers are not going to be able to succeed. Increasingly, as we get through and past World War II, agricultural production in the United States was much more of a large-scale corporate affair. What you're going to see is that mass agriculture is going to replace small farmers. And farms themselves are going to become corporations that oftentimes have monopolies similar to those industrial corporations that we saw during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. But nonetheless, again, there is a prominent effect on labor that World War II has on, in particular, women and the minority population. So again, just like World War I, this increased labor demand is going to bring many new people into the workplace that either previously had different kinds of jobs, maybe no jobs at all. But again, a lot of these gains are going to be temporary. So the demand for labor brings in Mexican immigrants and Mexican American migrant workers as well, Native Americans, African Americans, and women into the industrial labor force in much greater numbers. For example, female workers are essentially going to double in numbers in terms of their makeup in the industrial workplace. And in this way, they start to shatter a lot of the stereotypes about whether women are appropriately able to do the jobs of men in the industrial sector. They very much prove that they could. Many women try to keep their jobs after the war ends. But again, we're going to see that their jobs were always meant to be temporary. Some industries that welcomed women into the workplace during the war had actually already planned to lay them off once the war ended so that they can give their jobs to returning veterans. So again, some of these leaps into different types of jobs were only temporary gains. You're also going to see that in general, wages don't increase as rapidly as prices or profits, which suggests that the major corporations that actually own the industrial production are making more money than the workers themselves. You're going to see that there was some pretty significant union activity before the war itself. A lot of this was in response to the Depression. You know that there were certain acts in New Deal legislation that actually encouraged union organization, such as the Wagner Act. But once the U.S. enters the war, there's going to be less union activity and more consolidation behind the war effort. So actually, many major unions after the U.S. enters the war agree to what's called a no-strike pledge, which basically meant that they were going to continue to work despite their conditions to keep providing for the war effort. Even though they agreed to no-strike pledges, some unions were still increasing their membership sizes in many places, so they were still working to win new benefits, even if they were vowing not to strike when the war went on. You're also going to have about a doubling of the African American union membership size. You do see, despite the no strike pledge, that there were some illegal strikes that broke out. And what this does lead to eventually is some federal legislation that basically works to limit striking abilities after the war's over. In terms of war's effect on the home front, there are a number of effects just on how families are constructed, on marriage rates. So on the one hand, actually, despite the fact that so many American men were deployed abroad during the war due to the draft, many of them made the decision to marry before they did that. So the war actually encouraged marriage rates. However, since so many men were deployed, what you saw was that there were many families that were left to basically serve as single-parent households. You're also going to have, in general, a housing shortage that results from the Second World War. And there's also going to be a limit of retail goods that are available because so much of the wartime production industry is centered around munitions and other items that are used by the soldiers. So because there is some difficulty getting adequate housing and enough goods for the home, you are going to sort of experience additional difficulties in running the household. Again, like I said, there's going to be an increase in one-parent households once so many men are deployed. And since women are also going to work to sort of supplement their income while so many men are away fighting, there's going to be some issues with finding adequate childcare. This definitely shows a major flaw in a system that would accommodate more women in the workplace, that there simply was no appropriate means to take care of young children while women did this. So this is certainly going to be a priority for women in future generations, particularly the 1970 feminist movement. You're also going to see that because there were so many jobs available, there was actually an unfortunate effect on education. Now, jobs back then didn't require a high school degree. So many people actually chose to drop out of high school before they got their diploma in order to get a job because there were so many available. So at least in the 1940s itself, there was a decrease in high school graduation rates. But we will see that during the Cold War, there will be an increased stress on completing one's education. So again, this is going to be temporary, and it sort of coincides with the trends of the market. Another thing that you're experiencing is that public health starts to improve greatly during the war. To a certain extent, there's going to be greater medical and dental care available for Americans. And there's also a slightly greater understanding of what causes people to be sick. To us, it may seem really trivial, but you're going to see increasing emphasis among the medical community, things that oftentimes are sponsored directly by the government to prevent people from spreading diseases. In addition to just simple things like the common cold, there was also an effort by the government as well as other health organizations to stop the spread of venereal diseases, oftentimes contracted by soldiers when they came in contact frequently with prostitutes when they were deployed abroad. So there's going to be an increased attention to preventing those types of illnesses as well. One of the definite downside, negative effects of domestic policy that took place during World War II was the way that Japanese Americans were treated. Now, of course, since the U.S. declared war on Japan in 1941, there was a sort of increased anti-Japanese sentiment among the American population. And we also know that there was a pretty significant Asian population that existed in the United States for about 100 years at this point, ever since the gold rush. Now, this anti-Japanese sentiment contributed to FDR actually signing into law a Japanese Internment Act, which essentially removed Japanese Americans from their homes and placed them in relocation centers throughout the west of the United States. You could liken these to concentration camps, although their conditions were not as harsh. They did receive some moderate education when they were there, but again, they were limited in terms of how they could contact people from the outside. And of course, there was just the humiliation of the fact that they were segregated from the rest of the American population. Many of the Japanese who were interned had never spent any time in Japan. They were U.S. citizens protected by the 14th Amendment, and nonetheless were seen as the enemy and the other by the United States government. And this, of course, was particularly dramatic for people in the sense that despite all of his good reputations during the Great Depression, signing so many New Deal policies into legislation, that it was FDR himself who supported Japanese internment for national security. So it certainly gives you a sense of how, in a time of heightened awareness, that a certain ethnic minority can be the target of basically prejudice and also policy that may subjugate them. Now, there was an attempt by a Japanese American to basically rule the internment legislation to be unconstitutional. This was a 1944 case called Korimatsu versus the U.S. And in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Japanese internment. So again, this is a pretty major example of even the most significant branches of government basically upholding segregationist policies because they believed that national security was paramount. Now, to fast forward a little bit, the Japanese internment, although it took place exclusively during the Second World War, the U.S. did not actually formally apologize to the Japanese community until 1988. So we definitely get a sense of longevity there. Okay, in terms of race and the war, I know I talked about Japanese internment already, but other ethnic minorities also are going to experience a certain degree of persecution. Just like in World War I, we do see an influx of African American soldiers fighting in World War II for similar reasons. Many African American soldiers call their campaign the WWII campaign, V standing for victory. And so what the WWII campaign meant was that black soldiers would both campaign for the U.S. victory overseas, and they would also campaign for their equal rights at home. So some black soldiers and other supporters of the WWII campaign are going to threaten to march on Washington to protest for equal rights by race. And so FDR actually responds to that threat by banning racial discrimination in the defense industry. So while the military units were still segregated, FDR came out and opposed deliberate racial discrimination, which helped calm down some of the racial minorities in their distaste for the government in terms of their approach towards race. You are going to see that new civil rights organizations are going to emerge, and some of the older pre-existing ones are going to continue to grow. And again, just like what happened with some of the economic migrations during the World War I era, again, you're going to see a massive migration of African Americans, most of whom are leaving the South and going to find more industrial jobs in major cities. Even though this migration was in response to economic opportunity, this did not mean that every black migrant experienced a really warm and welcoming environment at their destination. Oftentimes they encountered very violent resistance from local whites who opposed African Americans moving into their communities and working in similar industries. There's also going to be a major anti-Mexican sentiment that originates during, or that proliferates, I suppose, during World War II. Some of this is due to the fact that there was a general association among white Americans that Mexicans were not patriotic. They targeted Mexicans in particular who dressed in this style. They wore what was called zoot suits, which were, sort of seen as flamboyant outfits, and whites who saw Mexicans dressing in these zoot suits would conclude that these Mexicans lacked patriotism, and oftentimes there would be actual riots and fights between whites and Mexicans who were wearing these zoot suits. This is an image of a zoot suit riot in Los Angeles, so you see that the victims of the riot were stripped of their clothes, which again were the reason why they were seen as unpatriotic. So you're definitely experiencing the fact that even though, again, many of these people were actually citizens by the law, many of these men were actually U.S. citizens, they were still treated as outsiders because of that increasing sense of xenophobia that sort of characterized the wartime. So lastly, before we move on to the last group of videos, let's talk about some of the characteristics of the men and women in uniform going into World War II. By 1939, so 2 years before the U.S. entry into the war, more than 200,000 men were in uniform. And again, the government actually began a draft before they declared war on Germany, Italy, or Japan. The officer corps that developed around the U.S. military were seen as very professional, conservative, and autocratic. You're going to see that junior officers were trained in special military schools and developed very close ties with their troops. Additionally, you're going to see an increased role of women in the military effort, which is definitely a change from the First World War, where you saw much less female involvement in the actual military and more female involvement just in the economic sector of the home front. And so you're going to see the War Department actually create some women's divisions of the major services for the first time. One example, you see a recruiting poster for WWII, which was a division for women in the Naval Reserves. But even though there were these military regiments that were created for women, most of these regiments stayed within U.S. borders. Many of them provided clerical or health-related duties. So again, it was rare for them to see actual combat roles. You did see some of these women emerge as pilots. There were a limited number of women who engaged in combat roles, but the idea was still that even though they increased their involvement in the military, it was much less their involvement was still definitely on a lesser scale than their male counterparts. When women were involved in the military more actively, the government took a greater effort in monitoring sexual activity, and they also continued to segregate the military regiments by race. And so some of this was to prevent, sort of disturbances, violence, conflict within the armed services, because they wanted to keep their numbers up and they wanted to keep unrest within the military down. Black soldiers definitely experienced racism at most points of their military service. You are going to see that that racial or ethnic minorities who served did feel like they maybe had a greater place in American society, but at the same time, what's going to happen is when they return from the Second World War, they're not going to experience the same kind of benefits that their white veteran counterparts did. So in many ways, their disillusionment after the Second World War is going to be a reason why the Civil Rights era breaks out in the 1950s. You are going to see that one group of people who tends not to get as much credit is going to sort of emerge as one of the true heroes of the World War II effort, and that was all the people who were employed as medics on the battleground. Medics were attached to each infantry battalion, and oftentimes their jobs were incredibly dangerous by entering in the thick of battle to retrieve wounded soldiers to try to nurse them back into health. And so the fact that many military duties, even that did not directly involve combat, were reasons for the U.S.'s success in World War II is very significant. We certainly should not forget people like medics as major heroes of the Second World War. you are going to experience, I did mention already that there was a degree of racism in the armed services. You also experience that there's a degree of racism in terms of how Americans visualize their enemies. Arguably, so on both sides, oftentimes one country will take their enemies and make them prisoners of war, right? Oftentimes only releasing them if they negotiate with the other side. So what we see is that when Americans took their enemies as prisoners of war, evidence suggests that they treated the European prisoners of war much better than the Japanese prisoners of war. So you do certainly experience a continued sense of racism in the American armed services. The last and third video is going to be looking at the actual stages of the war, and that will be it for World War II. So stay tuned for that next.